Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Melanie O'Brien, and I am the manager of the National NAGPRA program. I want to start today's webinar with just a couple of announcements. First of all, please note that we won't be taking questions, so please do not raise your hands during the presentation. We will open the Q&A at the end of the presentation, and you can ask your questions at that time. I have prepared a short presentation for today, which I'll get to in just a moment. But before I jump into the presentation, I wanted to make a couple of announcements. First of all, I wanted to let everyone in the NAGPRA community know that David Tarler, a longtime member of the National NAGPRA program, has decided to retire. He will retire at the end of May. David has served over 30 years with the National Park Service and the federal government. The last 20 or so has been with the National NAGPRA program. And I know that many of you have worked with David over those 20 years. And we will be preparing a kudo board. If you'd like to send David a well wish electronically, look for that to come through the NAGPRA Community of Practice listserv. And more to come on that. Also, yesterday, we provided some updates to our templates webpage that I wanted to make everyone aware of. We updated several of the templates, including some newer templates. If you're wondering if you have the right version, you can look for the year in the heading of the template will now be 2025. And I think I have a screenshot of the template page in a minute. And the last announcement is next month and in June. So in May and June, the monthly webinars will be hosted by Kate Compton-Gore. Of course, the National NAGPRA program team will be in attendance, but Kate will be providing those presentations. Okay, so for today's session, I wanted to provide some information about frequently asked questions that we've received in the National NAGPRA program, but also a little bit about some scenarios or examples that we can provide that might be useful in answering questions that you have about the NAGPRA process and about the regulations. So what I've prepared for you today is a series of resources and that will get to some scenarios or examples that might pertain to your NAGPRA work. So first, I wanted to remind everyone that, of course, the website resources are a great place to start if you're looking for frequently asked questions. Many of our web pages are actually in a question format because we realize that so many of you have a question to begin with. And so our website itself poses questions and provides answers. But in particular, I wanted to highlight the Getting Started section of our website that provides general overviews of NAGPRA, as well as where you can find more in-depth information. And of course, we have both a frequently asked questions page on our website under Getting Started, as well as a page called I Need Help With. We developed the I Need Help With page probably about 6 years ago because we realized that so many of the questions we were getting had an answer, a very clear answer. And so we tried to assemble those both in the I Need Help With and the Frequently Asked Questions page. So I wanted to highlight those and recommend them to you. Of course, both of these have been updated since the revised regulations were issued in 2024. And you'll find that these are useful places to maybe find a first answer to a question that you might have. In addition to that, just as a reminder, we do have a training page where there are a series of videos, trainings that are available, both from the last couple of years, as well as older video series. And if you've participated in these webinars before, you'll know that this time last year, I actually provided clips from an older video on consultation, a video from 2010 on consultation under NAGPRA, with the point being that these are still very relevant, that even with the changes in the regulations, that information that's in the video series from 2010 or the trainings from 2023, as well as the webinars from last year, are all still relevant sources of information that can assist you with your NAGPRA work. So we have recordings on the training page or links to them. All of our trainings live on our YouTube channel, except for these webinars. These webinars can be found on our events page. So recordings of these webinars are currently on our events page. We will work to migrate those to our training and YouTube channels eventually. And lastly, I wanted to point out the guidance documents that we do have available on our website. Again, on the policy page under law and policy, we have provided several documents that provide not only information about a particular part of NAGPRA, but also frequently asked questions. So we produced a duty of care frequently asked question document in January of 24. We just updated the steps to repatriation document, which is a visual version of the regulatory steps, with just some minor changes in that document. And then over the course of last year, we produced several guidance documents on the different steps to repatriation for human remains as well as for cultural items. So again, each of those documents includes a frequently asked question section that can be useful in identifying answers to those questions that you might have. I think that the longer I do this work, the more I realize that just about every question you have, somebody else has, and has likely asked it, and we've provided the answer. And many of those are available there. It's occasional that I'll get a unique question, but they're really rare. Many of the questions that people have are the same questions somebody else has. So these are all resources to help you with those questions. All right. Another great resource for questions and answers is in the material that relates to the regulations themselves. If you have been a part of the NAGPRA community and been paying attention to these changes in the regulations over time, you will know that we've actually produced a series of 3 different documents that contain comments we received on the regulations as well as responses to those comments. The first of these was following tribal consultation in 2021. And I included the link here where you can get that response to tribal consultation. Again, that document itself provides a lot of questions or comments that we received on the regulations and our responses. Similarly, the proposed rule that was issued in 2022 provides a lot of explanatory text that gives information that may answer questions that you have. And finally, although it is a big document, the final rule from 2023, published in December of 2023, effective in January of 2024, contains a lot of information, including a lot of examples of how the regulations could be applied. And what I've done today is taken examples from each of these documents to show you how they provide that information. And one of the easiest ways to find this is actually any one of these documents. You can do a search for the word example, and it'll take you to all of these different examples. Likewise, if there's a particular question you have or topic that you want to find in any of these documents, using the search function is an easy way to do that. Now, you have to be somewhat thoughtful about what terms you use. Obviously, if you search any of these documents for the word repatriation, it's going to be too massive to really navigate. But the word example is a great one. It's limited, I think, around maybe 50 or so occurrences in the final rule, and then even less in the proposed rule and in the tribal consultation response. So, but it can help you narrow in on those exact examples that might be helpful in better understanding the regulations themselves. So what I've prepared today is to walk through some of these examples. I'm going to maybe change the layout here just a little bit because, again, of the volume of text that we have today. Let's see. Just a moment, I'm going to change to the speaker view. Not sure that's any better, but we'll give it a shot. I know this first page is very small text. The next are hopefully a little easier. But again, all of this information is information that you can easily find. What I've done here today is taken screenshots actually from the regulations themselves, from the final rule or the proposed rule. And so the screenshots may not be easy for you to read, but hopefully what I've done on the slide is give you enough ways that you can kind of target these places in the final rule and find this information yourself if you'd like to study it more in depth. So in the introduction section, for example, we provide examples on duty of care, incorporating and accommodating Native American traditional knowledge. In fact, what's on the screen are 3 examples that are in the final rule about how a museum or federal agency might incorporate and accommodate Native American traditional knowledge in that duty of care requirement. Examples that are provided here, again, there are 3 examples here of requests that a consulting tribe might make for how to care for and store cultural items or human remains prior to completion of the repatriation process. These 3 examples are drawn from experience. I would say less experience and more information's been shared with our office. But in addition to that, I have shared some of these examples with people who work in NAGPRA and have had these experiences themselves to try to make sure that they resonate. Okay, so in addition to the duty of care on incorporating and accommodating requests from tribes, those examples that are in the final rule, there's also some examples on research, which we'll come back to later in this presentation. And there are some examples in the final rule about final agency action. So again, what I've tried to do here is highlight for you where you can find examples if these are topics that you want to find a better example of or more information from the final rule. There are a significant number of definitions that include examples in all 3 of those sources. So in the response to tribal consultation, in the proposed rule, and in the final rule. Each of these terms includes in the final rule or the proposed rule an example. The 2 that are starred here, federal funds and lineal descendants, actually include examples in the regulatory text itself. So I think it's important to remember that the regulations and the language of the regulations themselves is, I would say, 90 maybe 95% of the time, the answer to your question is in the regulatory text itself. But the examples that are in the final rule text, in what precedes that, the explanatory text, can be helpful to understanding the regulatory text. But there are very limited cases where the regulatory text itself actually includes examples. And in this case, in the definitions, federal funds provides an example of what federal funds means. Likewise, the definition for lineal descendants itself in the regulatory text provides an example of what lineal descendants means. And those examples in the regulatory text are useful in that they really are attempting to give a clear understanding of what the definition means. But in addition to that, there are, again, examples that you can find throughout the regulatory text related to definitions. And these are questions that we get quite often. For example, you'll see that in the section on the definition of human remains, there is a discussion in the final rule, as well as in the tribal consultation about animal burials and how those do or do not relate to human remains. This was a topic that came up quite often in the regulatory process, and there are multiple times where these documents refer to examples of how animal burials may or may not be treated under NAGPRA. And I point this out because these are the kinds of questions that we get in the NAGPRA program quite often by email. And the answers are really, a lot of times we just copy the answer from the final rule itself, provide maybe a slightly modified version of that same language. But it's already there for you. It's already there in the regulatory documents, and you can find this information for yourself. Likewise, there's significant discussion in all of the regulatory documents about how human remains may or may not be incorporated into cultural items and how those should be treated. So again, I didn't include any screenshots here from the definitions and those examples, but there are examples for each of these. Some of them are quite significant. For example, I've got to come up with another word besides example. In the proposed rule, we have several paragraphs dedicated to an example of funerary objects and how that funerary objects, how a description of how a certain circumstance could result in identification of funerary objects and then identification of whether those objects are associated or unassociated. So again, it's several paragraphs in the proposed rule that gives a specific example, an illustrative example of funerary objects that meet the definition and how they meet that definition. So again, I've pulled some examples here related to different sections of the regulations, and I've tried to include that at the top in the title, and then a screenshot of the text itself with below that a reference to whether this is the proposed rule or the final rule. So in this case, for cultural affiliation, there is an example that's provided in the proposed rule from 2022 about cultural affiliation and making that determination. And you'll see here the example is in the second paragraph. And there's an assumption here. This is what makes it a scenario or a hypothetical. Right? We took sort of broad outlines of what we've heard, what we've encountered from museums and federal agencies on these questions, and proposed sort of here's the example, right? Assume that all you know about individual human remains is that they were removed from a particular site and that the human remains have a date range that spans 1,000 years. Indian Tribe A has a relationship of shared group identity to an earlier group who occupied that site, as does Indian Tribe B, but with a different earlier group. So over 1,000 years, 2 earlier groups, 2 tribes that can have a shared group identity. So even though Tribe A and Tribe B may not have a relationship themselves, it doesn't preclude that A and B both have cultural affiliation to the human remains from that site that are to that 1,000-year time span. So again, our goal here was to try to help illustrate these regulatory concepts and the regulatory requirements with real practical examples. This is an example of where in the regulatory text itself there are examples. So in cultural affiliation in 10.3, under two different paragraphs, each numbered number 2, there are examples in the regulatory text itself. So on the types of information in 10.3b, we include in the regulatory language that one type of information may be sufficient to reasonably identify the criteria when no other information is available, and then give an example of how geographic information about human remains and cultural items may identify the 3 criteria for cultural affiliation. Likewise, in the paragraph on joint or multiple cultural affiliations, we have an example of, again, similar to the one from the proposed rule, about how multiple Indian tribes may have a relationship of shared group identity to the human remains, even if the 2 tribes themselves do not have a shared relationship. Here I wanted to highlight a discussion in the final rule on the timelines for disposition and repatriation. Again, this is from the final rule that was published in 2023, and discussing the timelines for disposition and repatriation. Repeatedly through the document, we discussed that there is no timeline for lineal descendants, Indian tribes, or NHOs to take action. However, there is a time frame for taking action once a notice has been published. So, for example, when a notice of any kind publishes in the Federal Register, there is a 30-day period for any party to make a claim for disposition or a request for repatriation. And on day 31, if a disposition or repatriation statement is sent, any additional claims or requests will not be considered. So this is a way of explaining that while there's no timeline for Indian tribes or NHOs to act, failure to act could have consequences, and that consequence is in not being able to make that request for repatriation. Piggybacking on this is another example on the same timeline, which gets to the question of repatriation or disposition on day 31 after a notice is published. And in a claim for disposition or a request for repatriation, an Indian tribe or NHO could request that disposition or repatriation statement be sent on that 31st day after publication. And then, of course, if competing claims or requests are received during the 30-day period, then that request could not be accommodated. If there are competing requests during the 30-day period, you have to move into the competing request part of the regulations. But if there are no competing requests, then nothing in the regulations prevents disposition or repatriation statements from being sent on that 31st day. And in addition to competing claims, other factors outside the regulations may require additional time before sending a disposition or repatriation statement. However, it doesn't prevent an Indian tribe or an NHO or a lineal descendant, for that matter, in making a request for how that timeline might play out in that request for repatriation. So again, examples in the regulatory text for how this might actually play out in real life are to get at real concrete examples in applying these regulations. So where a tribe is making that request for repatriation, nothing would prevent them from requesting the repatriation statement on day 31. There may be reasons why a museum is not able to accommodate the request, as we say in the last sentence. There may be other reasons why a tribe may not want that exact time frame, but might have other request time frames, and that's acceptable within the regulatory framework. We have two very similar examples in section 10.4 on plans of action that are important, especially for Indian tribes and NHOs, but also for federal agencies, in looking at how plans of action might be responsive to what a request from an Indian tribe or NHO includes. And in particular, we use these two examples to discuss how a plan of action might indicate that there's a preference for human remains or cultural items to be left in situ or relocated in a location nearby. And the plan of action might also require immediate removal of human remains to a secure, protected facility. There are any number of options that could be explored by the federal agency and the Indian tribe or NHO in developing what that plan of action might look like and what the result will be. And in this case, we're using the 4 examples in the regulatory text, in the regulatory documents to give more options where there is this discretion for how this might be implemented. Where the regulations don't provide a very direct requirement, then these examples give those options or the possibilities for how this might be implemented. And in particular, this came up repeatedly in looking at plans of action and the requirements on federal land, where preferences of tribes may be to leave items in situ or to relocate them in a location that's nearby. And that's acceptable provided that's what the plan of action details. In looking at the requirements in subpart C for museums and federal agencies to evaluate all holdings or collections and to identify in either an inventory or a summary all human remains or cultural items, there was quite a bit of discussion in the regulatory process around this question or this issue. And our response on this question includes several examples that I believe are illustrative. So in a discussion about which holdings or collections must be reported under NAGPRA, the museum or federal agency has to evaluate what it knows about that holding or collection. And through that process of evaluating what it knows, may be able to decide that a certain collection does not apply to NAGPRA. And the example we use here is a collection that is excavated from a historic era ranch that does not contain any Native American objects or items would not need to be included in a summary. In the next example, we actually received examples in the comments on the regulations. And in this case, several comments provided examples of human remains or cultural items that were not identified by museums or federal agencies. In one case, an archaeological collection was excluded from a summary because the museum assumed it did not contain cultural items. However, archival information about the person who made the collection clearly identifies the collector removed objects from a funerary context, and those objects are likely unassociated funerary objects. In another case, human remains were found during a physical review of a collection after the inventory was completed and a notice was published. This highlights that museums and federal agencies have discretion on which holdings or collections they include in a summary or an inventory. And when a museum or federal agency decides to exclude a holding or collection, it is deciding that the act and the regulations are not applicable to that holding or collection. If a holding or collection contains human remains or cultural items, the museum or federal agency has failed to comply and could be subject to civil penalties or other actions for that decision making. And this goes then into, again, the discretion that a museum has in how to evaluate its holdings or collections and how it decides what to include in a summary and in an inventory. And this goes to, I think, a question that we received. So we often get asked, what do I do with these Native American objects like stone projectile points? Do I include them in my summary or do I not? Well, that's a decision that the museum has to make, and it needs to make that decision based on the information it has. And it needs to make that decision in light of the fact that it has not conducted consultation. And once consultation occurs, then it could be that the objects, the tribe has no interest in a stone projectile point, for example, or maybe even early in consultation, it's clear that these objects are not going to fall into one of the categories, but it's still a Native American cultural item. The requirement here again is that the collection be referenced in the summary, but that doesn't mean that there's any additional effort that must be undertaken by the museum unless and until the Indian tribe makes a request for those objects. So the decision point here is at the beginning on which holdings or collections are included in either a summary or in an itemized list for human remains. And that is the decision point that museums need to consider what information they have before they exclude a collection. But say, for example, you include in your summary a holding or collection that contains stone projectile points. The work is done at that point until a tribe were to come forward and make a request for that object or objects as a part of a repatriation request. And then in those circumstances, the requirement for the museum is to evaluate the request, not to evaluate the holding or collection, but to evaluate the request from the tribe and the information that they've provided. This goes to a longer hypothetical or scenario when it comes to human remains that we included in one of our guidance documents. In the, again, going back to the beginning, I mentioned our policy page has guidance documents. And one of those guidance documents is about the process for human remains in creating an itemized list, which is step 1. And in that process, the museum has a lot of discretion in what it chooses to do with each box or bag or object that it has that may contain Native American human remains. And in exercising that discretion, that guidance document provides hypotheticals on how the level of information, there's no threshold of information that's required, but a museum has discretion to make that decision, and it should do so and make that decision thoughtfully and cautiously. I'll come back to that in a minute. One of the examples in the final rule that I actually I'm very proud of, I believe it's a very helpful example, is this longer example related to making a request for a cultural item. And again, so this is in section 10.9, and it's an example of how an object may have come into a museum's ownership or museum may have possession or control of the object, and how in making a request for repatriation, an Indian tribe could satisfy the criteria for that request. So I'll try to, I won't read it exactly, but I'll try to summarize the information here. So a museum has a pipe that was acquired or accessioned in 1985 from an individual donor, a doctor, who had originally received the pipe in 1965. During consultation, a traditional religious leader has identified the pipe as a sacred object that's needed for present-day ceremony. In speaking with elders, the traditional religious leader learned that in 1954, the government terminated the Indian tribe of the last Native American individual to own the pipe. That termination process resulted in the tribe's land being sold, relocation of the tribe's people to multiple urban areas throughout the United States, and the forced suspension of traditional religious practices. The Native American owner of this pipe was relocated to a metropolitan area in 1957 and was unemployed from 1963 until the end of his life in 1966. The terminated Indian tribe and the Indian tribe who identified the traditional religious leader have a relationship of shared group identity through origin stories and intermarriage and pipe ceremonies. The historical context surrounding the acquisition of the sacred pipe by the museum would be evidence to support a finding that the Native American owner, while the Native American owner had authority to alienate the pipe, the transaction was not made voluntarily or freely. And that comes from the facts of this individual's life, right? Both the termination of the tribe, the unemployment of this individual from 63 to 66, as well as the original donor, who was a doctor who acquired the pipe in 1965. In making a request for repatriation, the Indian tribe could state, first of all, the pipe is a sacred object. Second of all, the Indian tribe, not the terminated tribe, but the Indian tribe that identified the traditional religious leader, has cultural affiliation to the pipe. And this historical context surrounding the acquisition of the pipe shows that the museum did not have the right of possession to the sacred object. Now, this doesn't prevent the museum from countering that assertion, but this is how a tribe could show through its request for repatriation that the circumstances of the acquisition itself meet that criteria that the museum does not have a right of possession. A question we get quite often, in fact, I think I got 2 of these questions this morning, were questions about evaluating competing requests. And there's a section in the regulations about the process for evaluating competing requests. And in the final rule, we provided this example of how there might be competing requests, in this case for a funerary object, and that by using the regulations and the process in the regulations and the priority order that's established in 10.9, the museum could make a decision about who the most appropriate requester is. So again, the goal of these examples is to give context to the regulations, but also to set them within what we consider to be very realistic circumstances. In this case, a funerary object is removed from a marked grave site of a known individual shortly after that individual's death and burial. The human remains were not removed. They stayed in the grave. In 1940, the family of the person who removed the funerary objects from the grave site donated them to a local historical society. Accession records and exhibit labels at the historical society identify the individual who is buried with the funerary objects by name. A lineal descendant who can trace ancestry to that known individual requests the repatriation of these unassociated funerary objects. They then publish a notice of intended repatriation in the Federal Register, and an Indian tribe with cultural affiliation also requests repatriation of funerary objects based on that notice. By using the process under 10.9 for evaluating competing requests, the Historical Society can determine that the lineal descendant is the most appropriate requester. So again, just an effort to put some context into the process. Getting back to the itemized list, I said I'd get back to this, and I will. We provided some examples in the final rule related to how a museum may decide how to evaluate human remains, Native American human remains, and associated funerary objects as a part of preparing the itemized list that is required. And this goes back again to the duty of care requirements. And again, states that if human remains are present in a holding or collection, and this is in the regulatory language as well, that the number of individuals is at least 1. And the changes in the duty of care requirements, in particular for obtaining consent prior to conducting research on human remains or cultural items, extends that duty of care and that consent requirement to generating new or additional information beyond what is already available. And here we use an example. So for example, osteological analysis of human remains, physical inspection or review of collections, examination or segregation of commingled material, or rehousing of collections constitutes research. And research is not required in order to identify the number of individuals or cultural items or to determine cultural affiliation. Therefore, the research is not a requirement for the itemized list. We use again another example here. If a museum wished to physically examine its collection to identify the number of individuals and associated funerary objects, the museum must first obtain consent from the lineal descendant Indian tribe or NHO. And until that consent is obtained to do more physical examination, the museum must rely on the information available, the information they have, to identify consulting parties, conduct consultation, update the inventory, and submit a notice of inventory completion. I highlight this in particular because during the regulatory process, we received a small number, but nevertheless a number of comments indicating that research of this kind, physical examination in particular, but even more intensive analysis of human remains was a requirement of NAGPRA. And that's not true. It's never been true. There is no requirement in the law itself to do any kind of analysis of human remains in order to complete the inventory and notice requirements. And so we have reiterated that here by using these examples. And I think this is my final slide with examples. And this again looks at consultation on the inventory and refers to, this one is about how a museum or federal agency may identify consulting parties. And under the regulations, there is a specific time frame for museums and federal agencies to consult on human remains and associated funerary objects in order to meet that deadline for completing or updating an inventory. But it is still up to a museum or federal agency to identify those parties with potential cultural affiliation and to invite them to consult. And so we've provided some examples here of how a museum might do that. Based only on the acquisition history and the current location of the museum, a museum could decide its preference is to only invite Indian tribes who currently reside in the county and state where the museum is located. So again, if what a museum knows about its collection is that it was created by a local individual who mostly collected, made collections, sought collections, and collected items from this local area, then even without any additional information about the geographic location that these objects were removed from, a museum could use that location history, that acquisition history, and the current location to conduct consultation. Alternately, a museum could decide to invite all Indian tribes who previously occupied the state where the museum is located to participate. Or a museum could decide to invite all Indian tribes who reside in a wider geographic region. Or they could decide to invite all 574 Indian tribes and NHOs to participate. These are the choices that a museum gets to make. Neither one of these is a requirement of NAGPRA. The requirement is for the museum to identify consulting parties and to invite them to consult. Provided that the museum is acting in good faith, any of these options are sufficient. But a museum should keep in mind that there are deadlines for completing and updating an inventory and for publishing a notice of inventory completion. So there might be lots of ways that a museum might choose one of these options or another. But what we're hopeful that this example does is make clear that any of these options are viable options. All right, so with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm going to turn on the Q&A for today. and we will see how this goes today. We have had, as you may know, a lot of questions during these webinars. And today's a little bit more free form, and there's not a clear specific topic. In fact, the topic for today is questions. So this is your opportunity to submit questions. You can use the Q&A button to ask those questions. You also have the option to upvote a question. So if somebody asks a question and you have that same question, as my son would say, you can smash that like button and it will jump to the top of my list. Question, again, I'm going to ask you to please put the questions in the Q&A and not in the chat. In fact, I'm going to turn off the chat so it's clear where your questions should go. Okay, I'm going to start with question we got. Is the process different for repatriating funerary items to Canada? Yes, the process would be different for funerary items to Canada, and it would depend on a lot of circumstances there. Whether or not repatriation under NAGPRA, which is a U.S. law, pertains to items that may connect to First Nations in Canada, really has a lot to do with the objects, the cultural connection, but also to where the objects were removed, and more importantly, to where the objects are held today. So I can't really tell you all the particulars. It depends so much on the case, on the specifics of that case, but the process is different in that there needs to be an analysis of whether or not the funerary objects fall under NAGPRA, given the limitations, excuse me, of the U.S. federal law. Okay. Can I speak more about repatriation? Oh, we've got a little bit, so I'm going to go back to Canada for a minute. Collected in the 1890s in the Northwest Territories and housed in Iowa. Again, the objects themselves being removed from Canada, it would come down to whether there is a tribe a federally recognized tribe in the United States that has a cultural affiliation to those funerary objects. So that would be the starting place for how NAGPRA might apply to objects that were removed from Canada in the 1890s and held in the United States, would be the cultural affiliation question to a tribe in the United States. Okay. All right. The top question I have is, if you have Native American objects, arrowheads, flakes, pottery, not from a burial context or ceremonial context, how do we start consultation to see if they fall under NAGPRA? Great question. Thanks for asking it. You send a letter. That is what you're required to do under NAGPRA, and that is how you start the process. You share information about your collection in a summary. And a summary is no more than a letter, no more than a brief description of that collection. Really what you've got here: arrowheads, flakes, pottery. Geographic information would be helpful, maybe, you know, where the museum is located. Who do you send the letters to? That gets back to that last slide where you have that discretion of identifying how broad of a scope. What do you know about the collection? What do you know about where it's housed and how it came to be there? Could help you with determining who you send the letter to. You are required to send the letter to any Indian tribe with potential cultural affiliation. But there are ways that you might narrow that group of people based on, again, the history of the collection, the history of the institution, and the content of the collection might determine who you send the letter to. Okay, next top question is, if objects are included in a summary but no tribes have contacted the institution for repatriation, can those objects be used for exhibition or research? Great question. Thank you so much for this one. We do address this a little bit in the duty of care FAQ. So I'd refer you to that, first of all. But the question again comes back to, what do you know about the object? So they've been included in a summary. Check, good job. No tribes have contacted the institution to consult on them. So they haven't been actively requested for repatriation. The responsibility of the museum here is to determine if these are likely cultural items, meaning are they likely funerary objects, sacred objects, or objects of cultural patrimony. From your description, it sounds like you've determined they're not funerary. You would need to determine that you don't have any information to show that they are sacred objects or objects of cultural patrimony. And in that case, you could go ahead and exhibit them, keeping in mind that if a tribe were to come forward and say, well, that is a sacred object, that is an object of cultural patrimony, then that would change the conversation, and they would need to be removed, as well as be repatriated potentially, if the tribe made that request. So again, the decision-making here in terms of an exhibition or research of objects is based on what you do know about the collection, and ensuring that you've notified tribes that the collection exists so that they can come forward and consult if they wish to. Okay, can I speak to repatriation statements, and that there's a new template? Do we need a repatriation statement for remains that have already been repatriated? No, you do not need to redo a repatriation statement. The updated template is actually to try to make things a little easier on our end, in particular with the clear reference to the Federal Register notice. And this is based on our experience over the last year of receiving repatriation statements. In terms of how do you use a repatriation statement and when do you need to use that template, it's in going forward. So if you have a case where human remains have been published in a notice of inventory completion, but there has not been a request for repatriation, then once there is a request, you would want to use a repatriation statement. If you are in a place where the notice was published, a request was made, and repatriation occurred, even before repatriation statements were a thing with the 2024 changes, you're not required to use a repatriation statement. You can use the repatriation statement if you want to clear up your own records, if you want to ensure that you have a final document that explains the end of the repatriation process. You're welcome to use a repatriation statement. Some of you may have, under the old regulations, used something called a transfer of control letter. Whatever you have used is okay under the old regulations. It's with the new regulations and moving forward that you would need to use a repatriation statement. Likewise, moving forward, if you are sending a repatriation statement, there is an updated template which just fixes some technical issues and assists more with understanding which notice this relates to. If you have one and you're ready to send it, send the old template, that's fine. We're just trying to move into the new template to better capture some of that information. It doesn't change, the changes to the template don't change the regulatory requirements. Let me just remind everybody. The regulatory requirements are there. The template is an effort to help you meet those regulatory requirements. And so any modifications we might make to them are toward that goal of clarity and better capturing, but it doesn't, the templates themselves are not mandatory, or there may be other ways that you can fulfill those regulatory requirements. Okay, let me sort again. Okay. If ancestral remains are exhumed from property owned by a publicly held company, oh boy, hang on, I lost it. That receives federal funding, such as a railroad, does the company have to follow NAGPRA in order to repatriate those ancestors? A lot of that comes down to some, again, particular questions. So first of all, depending on when the exhumation occurred, may trigger some state law requirements, even from a publicly held company that receives federal funding, such as a railroad. State law might dictate what happens to those ancestral remains that are removed from that land, and it's going to depend on when that excavation occurred, what the state law is at the time, and what the state law dictates happens. So state law is a very important piece of answering this question. The second piece of this question comes down to, so the answer is, it was last year, and state law does not dictate what happens. I would want to be very clear that the state law does not say what happens when ancestral remains or human remains of any kind are excavated, because in most states there is unmarked burial laws and or other requirements for states when human remains are exhumed. However, if that's the case and there is no state requirement and there's no state law telling you what happens, then in this case, those human remains would be under the possession or control of that publicly held company. And in that case, if that public company receives federal funds and has possession or control of Native American human remains, then they would have NAGPRA obligations for completing an inventory and publishing a notice. So the question really hinges here. It sounds like the company receives federal funding. The question hinges on possession or control. So that's where the state law question, the state law says state has no involvement, the landowner who exhumed these objects has possession or control, then yes, that private company would have NAGPRA obligations and would need to complete an inventory and a notice. What if the human remains are exhumed from property owned by local municipality that receives state funding? Again, federal funding does not need to be direct, but can be pass-through funding. So if the county or the municipality receives state funding and that state funding, or I should say, if the municipality receives federal funding for some activity, roads, bridges, other ways that local municipalities receive federal funding, then it's likely that the local municipality has received federal funding and would be required to comply with NAGPRA. And you say that neither of these entities is associated with a museum. Remember that the definition of museum under NAGPRA is about two things: having possession or control of Native American human remains or cultural items, and receiving federal funds. It doesn't matter that museum is not in the name of the institution or the entity. It's about those two factors. And we have lots of examples of those factors. We have lots of examples of local municipalities that have complied with NAGPRA. I can't think of a public company off the top of my head, but I can tell you that a water utility for a city has completed NAGPRA. In many cases, or in many cases, state law dictates or directs that the human remains be transferred to a state museum or to the state archaeologist, and it's that entity that then complies with NAGPRA. Okay. Suppose tribal members want to research items in a collection that may be items of cultural patrimony. The museum asks them to obtain permission from the related tribe as it's required under duty of care. They're upset because their members, one of the possible communities of origin, but there are several, and they shouldn't have to comply as stringently as non-community member research for this reason. Who is right? Great question. So duty of care requires consent prior to research. For that matter, prior to access to Native American human remains or cultural items. So in this case, an object of cultural patrimony. If a party wants to access that object of cultural patrimony, and they are a authorized representative of their tribe, then they can certainly give consent on behalf of their tribe. In a case where there are other tribes connected to the object, then consent from those other tribes would also need to be sought. And I say it in that way, need to be sought, because it could be that there's a non-response on the part of the other tribes. And in that case, then the one tribe has given consent, and the access or research could occur. However, if there are other parties involved that object, then our advice would be to move to the repatriation of that object of cultural patrimony as quickly as possible, so that whoever is the most appropriate requester, whoever has the final possession or control of that cultural object of cultural patrimony, can make the decision about whether to allow access or research on that object. And that's again where there are conflicts between consulting parties or potentially culturally affiliated parties on who can have access. But I think that the thrust of your question is a little bit different in that you're saying that some of the part of your question gets down to who has to ask for consent. And I would say that there is a responsibility on the museum there to at least initiate some of the requests for consent. Your follow-up question here is, what if access to the object is necessary for consultation purposes? Again, that's where you need to consider access and consultation and what consent you do have. Clearly, if a tribe is coming to consent and wants to access an object of cultural patrimony, they are giving their consent to their access, right? You've got to apply some common sense to this to this process here. Really, the question is when there's a conflict. When there's a conflict between one tribe and another tribe, and one wants to access and one doesn't, or one wants research and one doesn't, then that's where our advice is to move through the repatriation process. Have the tribes submit requests for repatriation, evaluate those requests, publish your notice, and complete the repatriation to take the museum out of the middle of this process and the conflict between the tribes. The follow-up on what about non-response from, say, 3 of 7 tribes? Do we need consent from all? You do not need consent from all. You need to make an effort to seek consent. And what you need to do is be sure that you don't have any objections. But if you have consent from a potentially culturally affiliated tribe for access or research, you can move forward based on that consent. There's no requirement in the regulations for unanimous consent. There is a requirement that you seek that consent. Okay. All right. Can you please address the issue that artifacts that are not sacred, but rather just imbued with sacredness, are treated as sacred objects? How many institutions make clear this distinction to tribal leaders to prevent repatriation overreach? This problem is also in the defining of everyday items as items of cultural patrimony and funerary objects. And Audrey has added the citations here to deference, the deference requirement, but also to the definition of sacred object, which includes information from consulting parties and Native American traditional knowledge on that definition. And a follow-up statement there by Audrey museums don't make clear what is a sacred object, but tribal representatives do. And the way that a tribal representative makes clear that an object is a sacred object, or I guess to go back to your question, if an object is being requested for repatriation under NAGPRA as a sacred object, the tribe must make that request for repatriation. And it is in evaluating that request for a repatriation that the museum would determine if there is information, if the information they have shows that this is a sacred object. And in that process of evaluating a request for repatriation, a museum may determine, or in your words, make clear that the information does not support that request, that the object does not meet the definition of a sacred object. And in that case, they would need to respond to the tribe with that clear statement that the request does not satisfy the criteria. They would need to explain why, what information is it that shows that this is not a sacred object, and provide an opportunity for the tribe to provide additional information. I think that what you're alluding to here is more about a consultation discussion about whether something meets the definition or not. And while that's important, the real decision making and the real distinction that a museum would make is in response to that request for repatriation. So where there's a request for repatriation, a tribe must assert or identify that the objects meet those definitions. And whether it's sacred, patrimony, or funerary objects, and then it is in the museum's response that the museum would say that the object does not meet the criteria, and here's why. If certified letters and emails are sent to all tribes with a potential affiliation to human remains and no tribe responds, what is your recommendation for a next step? Audrey has helpfully pointed out some consultation resources available on our website, as well as a suggestion to follow up with emails and phone calls. And agree with that. Here we're talking about human remains, and the regulations make clear that there is a timeline, as I mentioned, for completing or updating an inventory. And since 1995, the advice of the department on this question has remained the same, and that is that a museum has to move forward even if there's not a response. The obligation here is for a museum to initiate consultation and respond to those consultation to anyone that wants to consult. But in the case where a museum receives no response, it's made a good faith effort to initiate that consultation, and I would encourage follow up with emails and phone calls. A museum can proceed to completing the inventory and publishing its notice. Let me just sort again. All right, a tribal researcher has requested to view a collection. They got permission from their council, but the collection is commingled and other tribes is commingled with other tribes and affiliations. Should permission consent be given to those other tribes? Should permission or consent be received from those other tribes as well? It's a good question. It's a difficult one to give a clear answer to because so much of it depends on what the commingled is. So for example, today is the for example day. For example, I was at a museum where their collections were stored on trays, large trays that slid into a storage unit. And on a single tray, there might be objects from multiple different culture groups on the tray. And they asked a very similar question here. And my response would be, was there some way that you can easily cover the objects that are not connected to the tribe who wants to view these objects? I mean, is it half the tray and you can just put a cloth or a sheet over it and that effectively prevents access? Or is the commingled meaning there's more integration of the collection, or it's impossible, maybe not impossible, but it is so commingled that you can't easily isolate different pieces of that. That would be, again, a question for how feasible is it for you to sort? How feasible is it for you to extract the material that one tribe is interested in from the material that is connected to another tribe? And then lastly, I would go back again to my previous point, which is that what you need to seek here is the both the common sense answer as well as what's feasible for the museum, but also where is there conflict? Is there a potential, is there a tribe that is opposed to the other tribe viewing their items? And in those cases, again, I think that the outreach on the part of the museum is the best first step. You included in your question that the objects were never sorted or separated. Again, I think it comes down to that feasibility question, or the practical sense of what are we talking about when it's commingled, and can there be separation easily done? Can the museum do that separation in order to facilitate the review of a collection? And if not, then I would encourage the museum to reach out to all potential culturally affiliated tribes and to seek to see if there is opposition to that access. What is the best way to amend the numbers published in a NAGPRA inventory if they appear different to those in our collection? And do those numbers change or come down to once a particular case has a notice of repatriation published and is no longer in our care? Wouldn't absolute record keeping make evident why the numbers decreased and then required reporting to NAGPRA? Maybe I'm getting a little confused here. So let me start with the first part, and then I'll go on to the second part. What's the best way to amend numbers published in the NAGPRA inventory? Well, first of all, let me clarify. Publication refers to a notice. So where a notice is published, part of what the publication in the notice is doing is saying how many human remains at minimum or at least are in a collection, or how many cultural items are being repatriated. If what you're talking about is the inventory and difference in the number of human remains or associated funerary objects reported in the inventory, which is not published but reported, then those changes may be made as you go to the notice of inventory completion. So again, this is a great opportunity for me to remind everybody that NAGPRA is not an accounting exercise. And the goal of NAGPRA is not to have a definitive number, but rather to provide enough information about a collection in order to facilitate repatriation. So therefore, I would have questions here about what numbers are wrong, how did you come up with the right numbers, and more importantly, what are the tribe's preferences on this question of correction? Is it important to the tribes to have some kind of accurate number or more definitive number? And if so, that may be better addressed after repatriation occurs rather than through the inventory and notice process. In terms of the numbers coming down, I do want to be clear that an inventory reflects those Native American human remains that are in your possession or control. And then those human remains are published in a notice of inventory completion when that inventory is complete. And it is the process of publishing the notice of inventory completion that removes the human remains from your inventory. So if you were to go to our website, and maybe I'll ask Audrey or Tanner to post a link to the notice or to the inventory database, That only contains those Native American human remains that have been reported to the National NAGPRA program, but not published in notices of inventory completion. Because once the inventory is complete, once that notice is published, you are then into the repatriation phase. And so the follow-up question about the record keeping, about why numbers decreased or increased. I'm not sure I'm following the follow-up, except to say again that NAGPRA is not an accounting exercise, but is a repatriation process. And the goal here is to identify Native American human remains in a collection. And if human remains are present, are represented in a collection, then that is at least one. And that number of at least one is sufficient to complete the NAGPRA process. And if there are updates or changes to the numbers, certainly you can update your inventory and provide additional information. Okay, let's see. Let me sort again. Can a federal agency determine if a plan of action is required for a proposed project without concurrence consultation under 10.4, or must this determination be made in consultation with tribal nations? It's a great question. So if we turn to 10.4 of the regulations, and that's what I'm doing here. I've got my binder here because I want to use the exact language in the regulations. A federal agency must determine the likelihood that an activity may result in a discovery. And the federal agency must prepare a plan of action for anything that is likely to result in a discovery or an excavation. Determining that likelihood should be done based on previous studies, discoveries, and excavations in the general area and in consultation with Indian tribes or NHOs. So if a plan of action is required, do you need concurrence? No. Do you need consultation? Yes. And of course, the details in the plan of action definitely require consultation. So can a federal agency determine if a plan of action is required? Yeah, but consultation is also required for that plan of action. So certainly consultation is a key part of a plan of action, and whether that consultation occurs before or during the plan of action creation, consultation is required. Is it a requirement to remove images of an object of cultural patrimony or just best practice? Tanner responded. Tanner is an ACE fellow with the NAGPRA program, as is Audrey. Both provided a response here that it's a best practice, but the best way to make a determination on presenting images is through consultation. The requirements of NAGPRA and the duty of care restrictions on exhibition only pertain to the items themselves, so to the human remains or cultural items themselves, not to the image of the cultural item. However, as Tanner reiterates, consultation on those images and the sensitivity of images is very significant, and it is in the best interest of the museum to ensure that they've consulted and talked to tribes about images as well as their use of those images. But it is not a requirement. Okay. like we've got just a few more here. I'm definitely not going to get to all of them. So if there is one that you really want answered, be sure you use the upvotes. All right. So top of my list is consulted with 2 typos and 1 more in the works. The first determined the remains were unaffiliated. Do we need to let them know the consultation with the third? Do I need to let them know of the consultation with the third party consulting? And then what's the process after consultation is done? You definitely need to let all consulting parties know who you're consulting with. And I think Tanner's given you some good feedback here on again ensuring that you're transparent and communicating what's happening if the first 2 have consulted and you're still continuing consultation with the third party. It'd be good to update the first 2 parties on the status and the process. What happens after consultation for human remains? The next step is, as Tanner referenced, to complete the inventory and to make that final decision in the inventory about cultural affiliation. There's a question about updating contact information, and we have a contact database, and if you send us your updated information, we'd be happy to provide that. The question was, would that update contact information in a published NIC and who the tribe would contact for a repatriation request? No, changes to our contact list would only update the contact list, not the previously published notice. I actually got a question related to this earlier in the week. There is, I think there are more effective ways than the Federal Register to update your contact information for a previously published notice. If a previously published notice identified a person that is no longer at a museum, and you want to reach out to tribes and let them know the tribes identified in the notice that there is a new contact person, I think that direct outreach is the best way, rather than updates in the Federal Register. Likewise, ensuring your museum contact information is up to date would be helpful, because even if the individual named in the notice or their phone number or their email address is no longer correct, having that new contact information attached to the museum would give the tribe who might be interested in making a request some way to identify you. I'll say that another suggestion I would have is that the museum provide that kind of direct contact information on its website, if that's an option. And to, again, I think the best possible solution, though, is the direct outreach to the tribes identified in the notice. Let's see. Sacred items, drum and pipe, were confiscated at a prison, but now in a museum display. And are they subject to NAGPRA? Audrey has pointed out, yes, it would depend a lot on the museum that's holding the objects. I would say, in addition, some information might be needed about the confiscation from a prison, but also how the museum acquired the objects would also impact this. If the museum displaying the objects receives federal funds, then those objects are potentially subject to NAGPRA, and a tribe could make a request for repatriation of those sacred items to the museum. Again, I think the hinge here, and like the example I provided about the sacred pipe, comes to how these were confiscated. What does the confiscation mean? How were they removed from the people who owned them? And then how did the museum then acquire them? And that's the information that a summary maybe won't provide in great detail, but a tribe can certainly ask for as a part of the summary consultation to inform that request for repatriation. And again, I think that there is, based on just what you've outlined here, certainly a path under NAGPRA for making a request for repatriation. It's the details of that request that would, I think, be influenced by what information the museum can provide. Again, it's pretty clear the request could happen. I think that the request could be more, there might be more information to provide in the request that could support the details of how these objects came to be in the museum. Sorry, that seemed very convoluted. Okay, I've been waiting for a museum to finish the inventory on 18 ancestors. How long do they have to finish the inventory? It's been since November of 24, since consultation. It does depend on when the museum acquired the human remains. This, unfortunately, I will say is a very common issue for Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations. And I think that I would agree with Audrey that maybe reaching out to us would be a good path to see if we can't help with some of the particulars here. This is an issue that the regulations are trying to address. This problem of the last 35 years where consultation or inventory completion has been ongoing. And the goal of the regulations and the revisions to the regulations is to create a timeline where inventories must be complete or updated. And at that time, notices must be published to again shift from the inventory part of this process to the repatriation part of this process. And so we may not have an exact time frame for you right now, but if we get some more details, we might be able to help you with how a tribe might make its preferences on the timeline clearer and see if they can't get the museum to adhere to those timelines. I think to add to this question, and maybe for a follow-up, and for those of you who might have similar questions, my question would be, what is it that's requiring the additional time? What is it that the museum's doing, and what is the project? What are the tasks here? All right. So we're just out of time for today, and I'm sorry again that I didn't get to everybody's question. I again appreciate Audrey and Tanner who have stepped in to help answer some questions. And we will keep a log of all of these questions so that, again, we have so many questions we've received and we've been able to provide so many answers. We're still working on a way to try to make that all available to you all directly. But again, I want to go back to my main message for today, which is so many answers to so many questions are in the regulations, whether it's the consultation from 21, the proposed rule, or the final rule. There's so much information already out there, and I hope that that will help you answer your questions, even if we weren't able to get to them today. So thank you all for joining us today. Have an excellent weekend, and we'll see you next month.